Can you hear me?
Welcome everyone. A few new faces, I think, that I don't immediately recognise. So this talk is the third talk, but I decided to talk about two of the Bojjhaṅgās together today, the third and fourth, Viriya and Pīti, rather than separately. And I think it'll become clear why as we go along. So first of all, the first one, Viriya. Wednesday is Viriya, and the Buddha Rupa for Wednesday is the Buddha holding a ball. This one is a fairly modern image, whereas this one is much older. It's reputed to date back to the 16th century, but I think probably some restoration has been done, particularly on the head. So Buddha with bowl. Now, I've talked about these day of the week images before and the relation to the Bojjhaṅgās, which is not really widely understood. There seem to be two traditions. One is the kind of cultural one, where lay people go to their local temple and if they want to make an offering or a puja, they choose the image that corresponds to their birthday, and they usually, each monastery, most monasteries I've been in, have a set of 7 of these images. And then there's the other tradition where the Bojjhaṅgās are also associated with days of the week. And very little has been written down about this. So what I'm saying is, I guess, my interpretation, and you may have slight variations, and that's absolutely fine. So the Viriya, on the cultural side, the story is that it refers to the Buddha after his enlightenment, visiting his birthplace, Kapilavatthu, where his father was the regional king. And knowing that he was coming, his father arranged a big banquet. But surprisingly to everyone, the Buddha didn't turn up at the banquet. And in fact, he went on alms round through the town so that everyone, and eventually his family and father, etc., could make an offering in the usual way to monks on an alms round. So the images of dana, generosity, dana in the sense of the person on the alms round, the Buddha in this case, is offering himself as a, if you like, field of merit for other people to offer food, which is ultimately something which is sustaining life. So dana, and also nekama, renunciation. This is someone following a quite different path to going to the local restaurant or a banquet. So renunciation and dana, 2 of the 10 perfections in the system of 10. But also Viriya, which may be less clear, but it's a new direction away from the kind of sensory world. It's a resolution in following this path, in making that statement to offer oneself for dana. So Viriya, and if you're born on a Wednesday, then just adjusting who I see or the speaker view. So if you're born on a Wednesday, you might wonder what your connection might be to Viriya. It's a quite interesting one with Viriya, because I know a few people quite well who were born on a Wednesday. And the interesting thing that I notice is that some of them, from time to time, feel they're actually quite lazy and lacking in vigour, whereas other people observing them, tend to think that they're rather driven characters. And that's saying something quite intriguing about what's actually going on in Viriya, and probably why, you know, there's the option of working with that for yourself, whichever one corresponds to you. But with Viriya, when I think of Viriya and that image of the monk with the bowl, I can tell you a story which comes immediately to my mind. When I spent most of 1992 in a rural temple in Thailand, there was an old monk in the temple who was renowned in the villages nearby, highly respected, in the 60s, for never missing an alms round in 40 years, more than 40 years. And the story was that he never missed whether he felt ill or not, rain or shine. And he, in his 60s, was quite prone to arthritis and rheumatism. So quite an effort for him. And one day on the alms round, walking through the nearby town, he was at the head of the alms round. He had been for quite a few years because the abbot, who would normally be head, was confined to a wheelchair by then. And the line of monks suddenly came to a stop. So the monks behind were craning their heads forward, you know, wondering what's going on, what's the obstacle. But usually monks are actually quite in a, not a hurry, but they're looking forward to getting back to the temple and eating. And so it appeared that there was a family, a youngish couple with a little boy, asking the abbot something. And he was leaning towards them, and he clearly didn't understand what they were asking, at least not to begin with. Then he did get the message of what they were asking him to do. And what they were asking him was to give the boy a blessing. This little boy looked to be about 4 or 5, was very, very sickly, and apparently had been ill for a long time, and nothing had really helped. So they're asking the old monk to give a blessing, but a very unusual blessing. And to give the blessing, 2 younger monks had to support him on each side while he placed his foot on the little boy's head. The couple, the parents were kneeled down, holding the boy up partly, but still for the abbot to lift his leg up and place his foot on the boy's head, he had to be held, otherwise he probably would have fallen over. And he did it with great aplomb, actually, as though he'd been doing it for years. But the image was startling because, you know, in Thailand, lots of you have been to Thailand or other Southeast Asian countries. It's a taboo to point your foot at someone. It's even greater taboo to point your foot at someone's head, but to touch someone's head is unthinkable. So this is like was like a kind of reverse magic. The villagers highly respected this monk. He had walked barefoot, because the practice in this temple was everyone walked barefoot. Every alms round, barefoot, no matter whether he was, you know, struggling physically. And the villagers believed that his determination, effectively Viriya, had imbued his feet with magical power. And that's why they asked him to give the boy a blessing. So, if you're in doubt about the connection between Viriya and the image of the monk with the bowl, that is what I would point to. So the image for Pīti is the Buddha in Samadhi on the night of his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Some of you may have actually seen this image when you've been on pilgrimage to India. So why this particular occasion, the night of the Buddha's enlightenment? So the story goes that the Buddha made a resolution to sit under the Bodhi tree, no matter how long it took, until everything was finished, until no more doubt, no more questions, everything was completed. In other words, the statement of Viriya, Then the first watch of the night, he was, according to the tradition, assailed by doubt, pulls back into the sensory world. Mara. It's described that he was confronted by Mara illusion. Whether Mara is real or not, it's standing for the last vestiges of attachment to the sensory world. And he overcame Mara, according to the tradition, and was filled by Pīti, filled by exhilaration and Pīti. And we're talking about both the mental but also bodily feeling, which led to the whole process unfolding over the rest of the night, through the jhanas, to eventual completion. With Pīti, if you wonder whether if you're born on a Thursday, you have a special connection to Pīti. I'm not sure how I would describe it, actually, because Pīti is difficult to pin down. You know, it's sometimes translated as joy, so does that mean that you're a very happy person? But it's not exactly joy. Joy sounds like a feeling quite close to sukha, quite close to happiness. The Pīti feels, when you're developing jhana, much more like the body waking up. And there is a kind of exhilaration in that. So I'm not sure how you would place it for yourselves if you were born on a Thursday, whether you feel some connection to that or whether it's something you feel you want to work on. Difficult to put into words. So, coming back to the talk, not the Buddha images. A quick recap for some of you who didn't listen to the previous two. The first two talks were on sati and Dhammavichaya. And the gist of it was that sati, in terms of meditation, corresponds to the first placing of attention to know where you are. It's like a mental act. In terms of our tradition, you could be placing attention on the number and the counting. And vichara corresponds to, sorry, not vichara. Dhammavichaya adds the quality of investigation, curiosity, meaning, not just placing your attention, but in introducing meaning, knowing something about your object, where you are, in our case, the breath, particularly in following to begin with. So when we were talking about those two factors, sati and Dhammavichaya, even though they start in a very, very simple way, and in that simple way they correspond very well to Vitakka and Vichara, the early stages of developing the first rupa jhana. And they also correspond to two aspects of attention in the brain, known to neuroscience. But even though they start off in a very simple way, I don't know whether this will make sense to you, but whenever we do that, whenever we start anything like that, there's an implication of where it's going to go, a kind of possibility of completion. And so in the case of sati, the full development will be all-encompassing sati, samma sati. And the full development of Dhammavichaya would be panya, wisdom, two factors of the Eightfold Path. So even starting in a very simple way creates a kind of possibility, direction. And so it's a very important act when we start meditation. In the Yoga Vichara that some of you have done, have practiced with me, in the Yoga Vichara, this corresponds to the invocation. Before you start a practice or anything in terms of a retreat, for example, in the Yoga Vichara, your first step is an invocation. Bring to mind the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, all the teachers that followed, right up to your own teacher, and maybe his lineage, his teacher and the teacher before him, down to you, and if you happen to be a teacher yourself, those you teach. And it sets up a kind of direction, a way ahead, which involves Viriya, and it's a direction which eventually will lead you to the path. And the reason I'm taking the two Bojjhaṅgās, Viriya and Pīti, together is because I think this is a major transition point in our practice. The first two factors, Sati, Dhamma, Vichaya, or in Tantric jhana, Vitakka and Vichara, are all connected with attention and actually very, very close to the sensory world. So someone practicing through Vitakka Vichara approaches jhana, the sensory consciousness gets disrupted. Last time I showed this picture, which is someone approaching, developing Vitakka Vichara, and the activity at the back of the head gets disrupted into little bursts rather than a random pattern, more continuous random pattern. And each of the little bursts is a disruption to the networks in the brain that support the eye, the networks of attention in the brain that support everyday consciousness. And in between, we get little silences developing. So this is someone who is developing Vitakka Vichara, but actually is getting close to the first Rupa jhana. And the fact that nearly everyone I recorded showed spindles of this form to some degree shows that within this tradition, pretty well everyone who's completed the 16 stages has some sense of the first Rupa jhana. You may not realize it, but probably if I was recording you and you doubted that, there would be spindles in your brain activity, but you're not aware of them physically. So everyone to some degree is getting very close or actually touching on the first Rupa jhana, but because it's so similar, so close to sensory consciousness, when you first touch on it, it can be very fleeting, and you may pop out into reflecting on it when you're back in sensory consciousness. And so that's what will probably be called the simplest level of experience, momentary. And it could be middling, right up to someone who can control the process, has mastered the first Rupa jhana. Now, back in the 1960s, 1966, Nai Booman was asked by a monk in London, "What do you teach?" And this was the time when there was a new Thai temple in East Sheen in London. And the monks who had come to populate that temple were all Vipassana practitioners, because this was the time in the 60s, 70s, followed, where samatha are pretty well being destroyed in Thailand. And so when Buddha was asked a question like that, they suspected, some of them knew actually, that he came from the samatha tradition. It was a loaded question, and normally he avoided questions like that because he was working at the Thai embassy. He was actually a kind of liaison person between the new Thai temple and the government, the Thai government, through the Thai embassy. So he had to be very careful. If he elaborated on, "I teach jhana," or "I teach all the jhanas," he would open himself up to criticism against this new orthodoxy of Burmese Vipassana. So he normally avoided it. But this was the only occasion I can remember where he answered the question, and he answered it very simply: "I teach the first Rupa jhana." And why he chose to answer it on that occasion, I don't know exactly. Maybe he knew something about this monk, who it could be useful to that monk to know. But it's a very intriguing answer. I teach the first Rupa jhana. And the meaning behind it is that if you can lead someone to experience the first Rupa jhana, even briefly, they will touch on some degree of stillness and peace at the end of their practice. And they will never, to some extent, forget that. Even if they give up the practice for whatever reason, maybe family reasons, career, moving away, the tradition is that if you can lead someone to that experience, eventually they will come back and will want to follow it through. And actually, the prime example of that is the Buddha himself. I'm sure you all know the story. That the Buddha followed all the leading teachers of his day and couldn't find the answer eventually to what he wanted. And then one day, he recalled sitting on the banks of a river. I think the occasion was watching his father, the king, leading the ploughing ceremony. And he was sitting on the banks of the river and dropped into the first Rupa jhana, and he recollected a feeling of deep peace, effectively freedom from sensory consciousness, but experience only. Just what he experienced is not thinking I'm separated from sensory consciousness, deep peace. And that led the Buddha to follow the whole process of developing the jhanas. And that was the essence of his teaching from that point on. So we got a pretty good example. So the point we're at now is a very important transition point from how do you move from the relatively straightforward experience of the first Rupa jhana into the second and higher Rupa jhanas. And in terms of the practice, this usually corresponds to someone starting to get familiar with the touch of the breath. Vitakka, vichara is mostly worked on in the counting and following. And getting familiar with the touch of the breath, to begin with, is another sensation, but it can become more and more subtle. And if you think of your own practice, you come to a point where once vitakka and vichara are more or less established and more or less effortless, you are much more in a feeling mode, and the beginnings of contentment arise. And it's usually nothing particularly spectacular, just a contentment with you're quite happy to stay with the immediate experience and not be pulled back into thinking, labeling, recognition. And that contentment is not a cognitive process. It's a feeling state, and it's much closer to a mental experience of your own consciousness, or the quality of your own consciousness, which is a point usually where the nimitta sign arises. But because it's not a clearly cognitive process, it's tricky to remember. And if you touch on it and then come out of your practice later without recollecting it, it's easily forgotten. So this is a key point in the practice to get familiar with that mode. And it's a mode which is the opening way to second and higher Rupa jhana. So you start with contentment. No need to worry about vitakka and vichara. The stillness itself is the satisfaction. And the breath naturally becomes more subtle. And there's the in-breath, the out-breath, and the nimitta. And the natural inclination is for everything to become more and more still. But on top of this, there's another level which is very intriguing compared from the evidence of the brain study. At this point, the networks in the brain, which are usually very complex, supporting our everyday consciousness, are no longer necessary. And a lot of that energy that usually supports that, effectively, which supports our sense of I, is released as free for the meditator. So apart from the new direction, Viriya, becoming established, a new kind of invigoration, energy, Pīti comes in. And this is when the thick practice starts to open up into the rest of the jhana factors, Pīti, Sukha, Ekaggata. So this is a very important transition point. And I'm mentioning it now because when we sit to practice later, just keep in mind that once you've established vichara in your practice, and you start to get that sense of contentment, and no need to go anywhere except where you are. It's actually beginning with equanimity, and it will lead you right into the deeper levels of absorption without cognitively having to control that process. Only to keep your mindfulness going and let everything settle. So, before we sit to practice, I showed some of the EEG recordings last time. I want to show you some again for this stage of Pīti arising. Actually, my agenda here is to train a few amateur neuroscientists, so I'm not the only one able to think about these things. So, this first recording is a meditator who is showing spindles, these little bursts in the back of the head, which I showed last time. So this is someone who's developed vichara quite strongly. And after a while, that settles down and becomes established. Something very different happens. Now, I've chosen this record because it's a simplified record. This is someone who's practicing Buddha. So it's a simpler practice to develop the first Rupa jhana than Anapanasati. And we actually have a few meditators within this Samatha tradition who know a little bit about Buddha. At the point that the person is given the instruction to develop Buddha, they intone on the in-breath, bu, the syllable bu, with the intention to arouse Pīti. And then on the out-breath, they intone do, so Buddha. And you can see this happening. So I chose it because it's a very, very simplified description of how Pīti arises. A few seconds after that instruction to start that practice, the frontal activity of the head, which is all to do with the kind of cognitive processing, is massively suppressed. The scale here is 150 microvolts per centimetre. So it's suppressed by about 300-400 microvolts. And the normal everyday consciousness levels are about 1/10 of that. And then the temporal lobes, this one is T3, and this one is T4. The temporal lobes are just above the ear, inside the ear, and they correspond to the auditory cortex. So it's not surprising they get hugely energized with the book, because it's an internal auditory syllable. So they get highly energized, and immediately afterwards, so does the frontal lobe. And then the sequence follows in the do into relative stillness. So a person practicing Buddha would repeat this with quite long gaps in between, increasingly long gaps in between, where everything settles eventually into peace, samadhi, and jhana. And the same thing happens in our practice of Anapanasati, but rather more complicated. So the second example is what normally happens in Anapanasati. So this is an example of someone who is about to develop the second Rupa jhana. And so they've been sitting for a little while, and you can see at the back of the head, these slow waves developing, very slow. This is the time scale at the top here, 60, 70, that's 10 seconds. So the rhythm at the back of the head is about 15 seconds, 10 to 20 seconds, very, very slow. Because everyday consciousness is normally, the rhythms are often below or above 1 second. And there's beginnings of a powerful slow wave at the front of the head. So the meditation here for this person carries on, and the slow waves get stronger and stronger as he develops the second Rupa jhana, until large areas of the head are showing this sort of activity. And the scale here is 200 microvolts per centimeter. So these are very powerful. You know, this one here, for example, the peak to the trough is about easily 600-700 microvolts. So this is far, far stronger than you normally see. In fact, the only comparable recordings of slow waves in everyday neuroscience are in deep sleep or in coma. And for a start, they're not as slow as this. They tend to be about 5 to 10 times faster than in meditation. But they're nothing like as powerful. They're normally about, these are probably about 5 times more powerful. If you look at the activity across the whole head, by doing, I can show you very quickly the spectra. Okay, so these are the activity across the whole head. Delta is the slow waves. Theta is the kind of waves you normally see when you're drowsy. Alpha is the resting state, mostly at the back of the head. Beta is the kind of thinking rhythm. This is dominated by slow activity at the front of the head. And here you see the beginnings of the vertical axis. Those of you who read the paper that was published will recognize this as the beginnings of jhana consciousness at the crown of the head. The third one, so slow waves, this is a signature of very strong pīti. Sometimes this very strong pīti can get unstable. And the third example is an example of someone trying to develop the first arupa jhana, infinite space, but going into the practice too quickly. And so the back of the head, you see these little rhythmic spikes coming. I'll show them more clearly later. The only time you normally see these in neuroscience is in absence epilepsy or children. And they're not normally confined to the back of the head. But this person is not dropping into an absence or not dropping into unconsciousness. It's actually highly alert and is totally unaware that this is going on, apart from a feeling of more energization to some degree. The person is making too much effort. That comes from the kind of discussion we have after these recordings to get the kind of subjective experience. Later on, this happens for this person, a massive, strong, slow wave, like the Buddha practice, which is intriguing because some samatha meditators with no experience of Buddha find themselves doing it almost automatically. So this person goes into a very strong slow wave, which, if you look at the peak, that's the left-hand plot. And if you then go into the trough, like that, or even more of the trough there, there's an oscillation from very high excitation to very strong suppression. And it's very much, for this person, it's like an automatic way of evoking stillness by exciting everything to a very high level, pīti, and then a form of passaddhi, which is what happens in Buddha. And at the back of the head, you can see the spike waves here. before I go on to spike waves, I've had to reduce the low frequencies to fit this on the screen. If I open the whole thing up to show you the real picture of all the frequencies, from very low to very high, I have to turn the gain down to 500 microvolts per centimeter. So this wave here, from the minimum to the maximum, is almost 3,000 microns. That's about a 10 times increase. No, 100 times, sorry. 3,000 compared to 30 in the resting state is 100 times increase in voltage, which means that 100 times squared in power. So the power that's coming out at this point for this person, for this short period, is 10,000 times what you would see in a resting state. Now, in 2017, I made the mistake of submitting a very brief paper to one of the leading journals, showing just some of the key features. And not this particular record, but some of the records showed very high intensity like this. And the reviewers didn't believe it, the paper was rejected. They basically thought it was a load of nonsense. And the spike waves, if you look at them in more detail, this is what goes on for some people without any awareness. There's no way of knowing this is going on. This is why I'm showing it to you. So the back of the head, if I take this trace, you can see the spike waves very, very clearly. They're almost metronomic, just like to some degree, like absence epilepsy, except they're not quite the same. They vary, different people, different frequencies, whereas childhood absence epilepsy is pretty well fixed. Also in epilepsy, the recovery between spikes is smooth. In meditators, you get harmonics. And the reason for that is also very interesting, because when you withdraw from everyday consciousness, the thalamus in the core part of the brain is triggered into this kind of ringing reverberation, desperately trying to find a way to reconnect to a network like it normally does in sensory consciousness. Anyway, that's, I think, enough neuroscience. Okay, so we come to the point of doing some meditation practice, and in a minute I'll share the screen while I light the candles and incense, and then chant the short form of the recollection. I'd like someone to follow that by chanting the Iti Piso. Debbie, would you like to volunteer to chant the Iti Piso?
Yes, I can do.
Is Mark around here in this lot of pictures? Mark, would you chant the Metta Sutta? You'll have to turn your microphone on when you do it.
Yes, I will. Yes.
Okay. All right, so we're ready to start. After the chanting is finished, I'll sound the bell. We'll sit for 20 minutes or so. Go into your own practice in your own way, and bear in mind what we're talking about. Arahang Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhaṅ Bhagavantang Abhivademi Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami Supatipanno Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho Sanghang Namami.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Iti piso bhagava arahan samma sambuddho vija charana sampanno sugato lokavidu anuttaro purisa dhamma sarati sa Tadewa manusanan buddho bhagavati swakato bhagavata dhammo sanditiko akaliko ehipasiko Opanahiko pachatang vedita vo vinyuhiti Supatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho Ujjupatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho Nyayapatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho Samicipatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho Yadidancha tari purisa yugani atta purisa pugala esa bhagavato sāvaka sangho Ahuneyo Pahuneyo Dakineyo Anjalikaraneyo Anuttaran punya ketang lokasati
Yasanubhavato yanka nevadasanti bimsanang yam hichewa nuyunjanto ratin devamatandito Sukkang supati sutto chapapang kinchina passati evam adigunopetang paritantang vanamahe Karaniyamatta kusalena yantang santang padang apisamecha Sakko ujucha sujucha suvacho chasamudu anatimani Santussako cha subaro cha appakicho cha sallahu kawundi Santindriyo cha nipako cha appagambo kulesu ananugido Nachakudang samachare kinchiena winyu pareyu pawadeyum. Sukino wa kemino hontu sabbe santa bawantu sukitata. Yeke chipanna buta tita sawata warawa anawazeza. Dika wa ye mahanta wa majjima rasaka anukatula. Dita wa ye cha atita ye cha dure wasanti awidure. Bhuta wa sampawesi wa sabbe satta bhavantu sukhitata. Naparo param nikubeta nati manyeta katachinam kinchi. Vyaro sana patika sanya nanya manya sadukha mitcheya. Mata yata niyam puttanga yusa ekaputta manurake. Evampi sabba bhute sumana sambhavaye aparimanang. Metancha sabba lokasmimana sambhavaye aparimanang. Udang ado chatiriancha asambadang aweram masapatang. Ditancharam nisino wa sayano wa yawatassa vigata middo. Etang satim aditeya brahma metam viharam midamahu. Ditincha anupagamma sila vadasanena sampanno. Kamesu vinaya gedang nahi jatu gabbaseyang punareti.
I'm placing this practice today in the Milton Keynes Center so that it doesn't feel too neglected. So I'll sound the bell in a minute and we'll practice for about 20 minutes and I'll sound the bell at the end. So try to stay with the stillness that you just experienced for a few moments before you move too much physically or mentally. And then what comes out of that stillness when you start to return to normal functioning, normal cognitive functioning. So if anyone wants to verbalize anything, few words, doesn't matter what, it's almost certainly going to be of interest to other people in the group, because even though we're in a virtual space, there's still a connection. So if you want to verbalize or say something, please do, and there's no need for anyone to respond. And then if a second person wants to say something, maybe totally different, not a response to the first one, then do so. And then maybe a third person. And let's just see what comes up. Probably something that's interesting to me, relevant to the whole group.
Yeah, what came to mind for me was, and Paul was talking in the talk about being unaware of these kind of spikes in activity, spindles. And I was just wondering whether in fact we are on some level kind of almost just kind of below our normal awareness, aware of these kind of changes, and actually part of us wanting to kind of go with it, and part of us maybe kind of resisting that change. And just interesting the extent that we feel able to let go into this kind of really quite, when you look at it on the chart, a dramatic change in our consciousness, and the extent to which we kind of hold back from that and try and maintain our sense of normality, and that kind of tension between those two quite different ways of experiencing things when we're in the practice.
Yeah, following on from what Will said, I found in the first two stages, particularly bearing in mind Vitakka and Vichara, that of this real stillness and gentleness, and could feel that sense of what Paul was saying about, you were saying, Paul, about contentment. And then as it went deeper, just this massive sadness. And then it's quite difficult to know how to deal with that.
Yes, I mean, I think, again, following on from what Anne has said, it seems...
Can't hear you very well, Francis.
Sorry, okay. It seems part of it is allowing ourselves to experience in the kind of body, or perhaps in the mind body, fully what starts to come up, and whether it's some sort of kind of subtle energy, or it's sadness, or some other experience. It's as though if it goes to thoughts, or to almost even to labeling, that can get in the way of just allowing it to be experienced in the body or in the mind. And to me, sometimes it feels as though the whole heart is being stretched almost when things start to develop, and when almost allowing oneself to be stretched internally, but not always easy.
Maybe one more before I leap in.
Yes, I was sort of wondering about orientation in a sense of that move from whatever the cognitive world seems like to a sort of world of feeling and sensation that one, I guess, gets familiar with in various ways. But I suppose I don't know if it's a sort of a clear question, but a sense of what orientates one at that point. I guess it might be what one brings into the practice, so a sort of intention, and how one begins and continues, what one's familiar with, and maybe also what arises and takes one's interest. Maybe a little bit of what Will was saying in terms of the pull between moving back to the normal orientation and then whatever one is working with that's new. But I suppose it's just a question, really, where one finds that orientation in that sort of different sort of space.
Paul, earlier on you spoke about waking up the body, or engaging with the body, or coming to know the body in a different way. So what was coming up in the practice was something about the different lengths of breath. Bunman often spoke of linking each of the jhanas to the different length of breath. And I'm wondering about the different qualities of Pīti Sukha that arise in the different lengths of breath. In a way, my question arises from Paul Beck's question, which is about orientation. There's something about Unman reminding us that the duty of mindfulness is to have this awareness of the length of breath. But when one is very concentrated and working with piti, the sense of the length of breath is very subtle. It's not completely connected with the physicality of the body anymore. So I suppose my question is something around the quality of the piti. It seems strange that the piti isn't, as it were, a particular experience. It's something you're wrapped around or working with the length of breath. I suppose is my kind of question or query or a desire to explore further.
So thinking of those comments backwards, what you're saying, what David is saying, is in a way leading straight into probably the next talk around piti and how it is incorporated into samadhi by tranquilization, by passaddhi. But it'll come into what the response is, I guess, to the other questions. So again, in no particular order. So going backwards, Paul, you mentioned about the what is it that sets the kind of direction at that point? Because you could, in the beginning, you could imagine as a relatively inexperienced beginner coming to this point perhaps quite quickly. In the first year or the second year, you've done quite a lot of work on Vitakka Vichara. You come to the touching and then the beginnings of the settling. And there isn't really a clear direction for many people. And so often it doesn't develop easily. So it's very, very important that the teacher knows how to kind of steer you in the right direction. And that can be in all kinds of ways. Through Dhamma talk, through which sets an idea, a sense, a feeling of being connected to a lineage. Maybe the teacher's own lineage, just simply by the way he explains things and directs the practice. In the Yoga Vichara, deliberately invoking the lineage. And so then you sit to practice, you let all that go, but it's still latent as a kind of way forward, to let go of the complexities of everyday thinking to something you've not experienced before, which itself is a kind of direction. To be able to let go into something you've not experienced before. And that takes quite a lot of confidence and courage. And again, it depends on the context. And the teacher can be very important, but also the group. So sitting in a group is very, very helpful at this stage, because even if you don't have a clear direction of your own, across the whole group, there will be a direction. And that can be very, very helpful to allow you to let go and feel more confident. It's as though the group is more able to tie into the lineage, because it kind of supersedes the details of each individual person's connection to that lineage. So there's that. And then we went into the practice after showing the brain activity and the what actually happens when we move beyond Vitakka and Vichara and piti starts to arise. Energy is released. And it's like Buddhist would say, when he gets people to sit in front of the class in a meditation retreat and ask them to show how powerful the practice can be. Now Buddhist used to love to do this. And you look at the records in the brain, and it is indeed extremely powerful. And you can, with no doubt, feel it in the body, as Francis was saying. the energy is like a waking up of the body, is the way I would see it. And you could literally see it in the in the brain activity. One of the records I just showed, the person who was showing very, very strong slow waves, actually progressing through the second towards the third rupa jhana, you could see the core crown of the head in that record, just behind the crown of the head, becoming very strong. So a vertical axis develops, quite different to the front-back axis of subject-object in sensory consciousness. I wonder whether that's connected to what you're experiencing subjectively, Francis, in the stretching. The subtle feeling of connection between the head, the mind, and the body. And this sense of the body being very involved at this stage is very important to understand a little bit more and play with it yourself. For example, quite a number of people in samatha do something like Tai Chi or Qigong or martial arts, and they found it extremely helpful. You don't have to be an expert in that, you can invent it. And so if you're doing any of the movements typical of Tai Chi, like even just moving your arm very slowly from one side and then maybe to another. If you watch someone who's really feeling the movement, you get a flavour of the same thing that we're talking about in meditation. And in terms of jhana, what's described in jhana as the fine material is, I think, getting familiar with that level of very subtle bodily sensation. So anything that helps with that, you can invent it for yourself. It helps you get familiar with that level so that it's not too much of a shock. Because as Anne was saying, this is very powerful. And when you go into that mode where the whole thing becomes connected, the body and mind, then it can release all kinds of experiences, sometimes blissful, sometimes very sad, which are often contained in the body, as well as trace memories in the mind, in the brain. And people who've been practicing for, say, substantial amount of time, 5, 10 years, certainly 10 years, invariably find that it will release at this point some trace memories, not necessarily verbal memories of something happening, but memories of feeling memories. And it can be a great release. It can also, if you're not familiar with it, be slightly disturbing. But the more familiar you get and become able just to stay with it on that feeling level, then it's very healing.
Yes, it is kind of connected to that. I was thinking also that sometimes that kind of really deep sadness can be about a kind of recognition of that there isn't a me in the way that we take it to be, and that can be I could be sad because that is what we can feel about that sort of shift and change and the impermanence and so forth. And that's why that connection to the Brahma Viharas is also, if one is in a position that is there, to have great compassion for ourselves and metta, and at points equanimity. But it seems to me to be part of a process. it's you know you did we use the term, or was the term used earlier about a kind of falling away? And so like that quality.
Yeah. I think that's terribly important, because we're in a situation where there's a lot of suffering, and we see lots of examples on the news of people dying alone, and their children and families not able to be there when they die or say goodbye. And that can come as a real shock to those people. And it arouses, when you hear those thoughts, a whole mix of feelings, including compassion, sadness, and so on. In some sense, I agree completely that this letting go of the kind of all the things that support the sense of I in the sensory consciousness is a huge challenge to identity. And what does identity mean? You're still aware, acutely aware. So consciousness doesn't disappear, but it doesn't disappear until way, way forwards through not just the Rupa jhanas, but the Arupa jhanas. Consciousness is still there. So this is going to come up. The feeling of it could be loss. On another occasion, it could be freedom. So there's a lot to get familiar with. In a way, some people would describe it as almost like getting prepared for, or preparing for your own death, and needing to understand, the supports for sustaining your core sense. With the Brahma Viharas, definitely metta, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity at points, all at one point or another, and mixed together. And this is so important, I think, with what's going on now. People, in a way, are being forced into dealing with some of these things. But undoubtedly, in meditation, this happens at this point in the practice in a very, very personal, deep, deep way. Earlier on, sometimes your meditation teacher might have suggested coming out of samatha, and the moment before you leave and get up, bring to mind the three signs of impermanence: anicca, impermanence, dukkha, suffering, and anatta, no self. Similar thing, but actually in the stage we're talking about, in the separating from sensory consciousness, it happens much, much more directly. You don't have to bring to mind any external memory or symbol of anicca, dukkha, anatta. It's in your direct experience. So this is terribly powerful. Very different to most other kind of mindfulness Vipassana traditions.
Yeah, there's a kind of, when you put down a burden, there's relief. If you've been carrying heavy shopping bags and you put them down, there's a relief. Or when you realize you've been carrying something that you hadn't previously realized you've been carrying, and you put it down, there's a kind of relief and joy in that.
Yeah. When Naguman started to teach the formless jhanas, to some extent he did it slightly reluctantly. We had to nudge him for a couple of years, and then he started to teach the formless jhanas. And some people, it aroused quite a lot of fear, because even more of a challenge is to feel that you don't have the supports or the familiarity of the nimitta and the structure of Rupa jhana. But I remember one practice where it started to really kind of make sense to people in one of the retreats he took. And towards the end of that retreat, he asked people to, in between practices, if they wanted to, walk in the grounds, the extensive grounds of the Samatha Center, beautiful surroundings, and bring to mind nothingness or emptiness. So it must have been the stage where, during the retreat, we come to the point of talking about the third arupa jhana, nothingness. And people in the evening meeting, the Dhamma discussion, what came up was very interesting. If that had been asked maybe a few years earlier, when the beginning of introducing it, I think we would have got a very, very different response. But the theme for quite a few people was giving attention while walking to background awareness of nothingness or emptiness, aroused a feeling of great spaciousness and freedom. No fear at all.
I just wanted, could I say something? I've just, in the light of what everybody's been saying, I was just going back to experiencing settling of, it seems another way, it seemed to me like it was if it's a coming together of mind and body, there's going to be all that sort of mixing that's going on of sorting out sukha from dukkha. And when one's within the settling, it just struck me in the light of the comments about dukkha arising, is that's always, I've always found it quite interesting. Paul mentioned it once before, of not repressing dukkha, but then on the other hand, the fear of proliferating dukkha as well in that situation. And for me, I was just thinking about it, and we've been doing a Abhidhamma Dhammasangani group, and looking at Javana, which is a sort of Kamma consciousness as it takes over. And it's almost like that's sort of happening at that level. But we have a choice, a beautiful, subtle choice at that level of changing the course of that Javana, a consciousness or something. And how do we do that? Well, the gift, it seemed to me, that my Booming has offered us is the gift of the breath, and it's almost like that to me is where the length of the breath comes in, and also with what Paul talked about right in the first talk about when we talked about mindfulness connected with this practice. There was a very strong link with samatha that actually recalling what length of breath is helpful at that point, and that almost gives one the space to be able to reconnect with the object of practice, because usually what will have happened at that point is this was at a subtle level, it seemed to me, my experience anyway, it's you've lost the object, and it's almost like the point where confidence and faith and trust is needed is at that point where you notice that dukkha is there. You're allowing it to be present, but then you're almost having to hand over to the body the knowledge of what the breath is that's needed, and trust, and then just lightly keep awareness of that sort of length of breath, and that gives you then the space to recollect. Perhaps you need to go back a consciousness to sort of recollect what the object is at the time, and then knowing that in our practice is our safety, isn't it? It's our safety net, is sort of recalling our sort of, it's just thoughts as everybody's talked about it.
Well, I think you described it very well, and actually the process you're describing, as you know, behind what you're trying to put it into words, is a very subtle process. It's very delicate. And I think you described it very, very well. Maybe we're just thinking of time is coming up to 12 o'clock, whether that's quite a good point to end on. There's already a direction here which needs to go further. But we can't fit it all in today. But you can already sense, once you've set up the beginnings of the second Rupa jhana, the whole process is somehow known. And in the talks that were, and the questions and comments that are coming out, you can recognize some of that there's already a connection through to what else we're going to consider and talk about in these talks on the Bojjhaṅgās. So I'm going to sign off at this point. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Next time.